We're in our fourth week of our series through the Gospel of Mark, called Mark, Son of God, Suffering Servant. Going through one story a chapter as we venture all the way to Easter. In the last few weeks, we've talked about Jesus claiming to be Lord over both the forgiveness of sins, which is something that only God can do, and over the Sabbath, which is something only God can do. And so again, we find him declaring himself as Lord over something in this story, as doing something that only God can do. And so this morning, as we unpack this story, we need to ask ourselves, what does this tell us about Jesus? And then why does this matter in our lives? We're going to be in Mark 4:35 through 41 this morning. This is what the word of the Lord says. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, just as he was. In the boat, there were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." So let's unpack the story a little bit together, verse by verse, going through why this is such a unique passage in the Gospel of Mark. We start off in verse 35. It says, "That day when evening came." So we'll stop right there. What is that day? It's not a reference like a day of the week. It just means that at the end of that day, the day that most scholars believe he preached the rest of chapter 4. Some of the most iconic parables, the parable of the sower, of the mustard seed, of the lamp and the stand. He had been preaching all day long these great parables about the kingdom of God to a big crowd of people. So he gets to the end of the day and he's likely tired. He'd been preaching all day long. I have to take a nap after preaching twice on Sundays. He preached for the whole day. He was delivering all of these great words of wisdom and parables, and the crowds were there to see him. And when evening came, he said, "Let's go over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee." And next week, we'll see why he was going over there. He had a plan in mind to do a great work in the eyes of the Gentiles, but he wanted to leave right then. He wanted to go across at evening. It's not something that you usually did, but he told them, "Let's go over." And so we get this very interesting departure from the crowd, even though the text tells us even some boats followed them. Even crossing the Sea of Galilee at night didn't fully get him away from the crowds. He says to his disciples, "Let's go across to the other side." And this is an interesting place that we find ourselves, because this seems just like a story we've heard a bunch of times over, but we need to remember that just a few weeks back, we talked about Jesus calling at least 4 of them out of their boats. These are some of them fishermen, almost all of them people who lived along the Sea of Galilee, who knew how to sail, who knew how to fish, who were experts on the water. They'd been out of their comfort zone this whole time with them, out of the boat, walking around, talking with Gentiles, watching him deliver people from demon possession, watching him heal people and do miracles. And now they have kind of their shining moment. Something I can actually do, right? I can sail a boat. I can do that, right? So yes, let's take you. And so we have this interesting kind of difference in language where Jesus said, "Let's go, let us go to the other side." And then the next verse, it says that they took him along. They took him along. just as he was. Almost as if Jesus was saying, oh, are you guys going across tonight? Can I hitch a ride? They were like this, the non-seafarer, the non-boat expert he's just along for the ride. We are now the ones who are in their element. They're following Jesus around day by day, not knowing what the next day is going to come, not knowing what half the things he's saying means, not knowing what's going to happen because he keeps doing miracles every day, but now they're in their element. And so they say, Jesus comes along with us. Just as you are, just get in the boat. We'll take care of everything. This is our time to shine. Finally, something that we can do. And there were other boats behind them. And so they set off. It's about a 6-mile journey. It would have taken them about 2 hours as skilled salesmen, right? As they go across, we know they're going up to the northeast side of the lake. But then chaos kind of strikes for them. Verse 37 says, a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. So let's unpack this a little bit. I'll give you some, maybe a better visual. If you were here this morning at 8:15, you would have seen me with a tape measure measuring out our center aisle. That's because we know from context how big a boat was at that time. And it's also really interesting, I think a great thing for us is that the boats at this time were almost exactly the size of our center aisle. 27 feet in length, 7 feet in width. We're a little narrow, we're about 5.5 feet. And then 4 feet in height. We're about 3.5 feet to the top of the pew. So if you're here in person, you can see the center aisle. Know that this whole story happens in a boat that's basically that size. This is it. That's it. They're all piled in this boat. 4-foot walls with the squalls we know from context reach 8 to 10 feet on the Sea of Galilee. So you don't have to be good at math to know that when an 8-foot wave hits a 4-foot wall, a bunch of water goes in, right? The Sea of Galilee was synonymous for this because it was, again, just about 6 miles across, but it was also 600 feet below sea level and had these big, what they called mountains, we might call hills on either side with these big valleys cut into them. And so the air would spiral in and across, and it would cause what the NIV calls a squall, but other translations call a whirlwind. Almost like tiny water tornadoes spinning up all around them, these crazy storms that would come in with the cool evening wind. And so often you didn't cross at evening, but they're experienced in the boats. They're the fishermen. We can do this. Jesus just needs to take a nap. They're in their boat. And the squall comes upon them. And it says that Jesus is in the stern. If you know anything about boats, that's the back, right? But it's also where you steer from. So likely somebody's standing right next to Jesus trying to steer through this. And we don't know. This is a little bit of me digging into the context, but I would like to believe it says that they were almost swamped. It means that they weren't waking Jesus up. They were doing everything that they could to make sure they didn't wake him up because they didn't want to fail. They're bailing out water and the waves are coming in and they're bailing out water. And we need to remember these aren't just a bunch of oafs and idiots. They're skilled in a boat. They know what they're doing. They're in their element. And it says that Jesus was asleep on a cushion in the back. And in our mind, we might think like, oh, he's on a mattress. He's just having a luxurious little nap in the back. Most scholars believe that it's somewhere between maybe a bench cushion that we would put like on a pew and maybe even a large bag of sand they used for a ballast or an anchor. It wasn't something luxurious. It, in my mind, makes me think of the times I've traveled through major airports and you see the person who's on their like third layover. They've been traveling for 2 days and they're asleep, hunched over their sleeping bag or their suitcase on the ground, right? He's exhausted. He's just passed out in the back of the boat on something that's not wood, right? He's not down below in like a captain's cabin or anything. It's this tiny boat, again, the size of our center aisle. He's asleep in the back, and they wait until they're about to take on so much water that they're going to sink to the bottom of the Sea of Galilee. And then they come to him. They woke him and they said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" This is interesting language, but this is where they find themselves. This is a famous painting about the storm on the Sea of Galilee. Tossed about. This is where they find themselves. Waves crashing in. They're bailing out water. Jesus is sleeping through all of this. We see this elsewhere in Scripture with things like Jonah sleeping through the weather. Teacher, don't you care if we drown? So it's important to point out a few things about their language choices here. They don't call him Lord, or they don't call him Savior. They don't call him Messiah. He's the teacher. He's the guy who's been teaching all day. They're the boat people. He's the teacher. Here are the boat people. We're on the boat. Teacher, not Lord, because in the situation, they can't see how he would be Lord in that situation. The storm is Lord in the situation. He is teacher. And so they say to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" I think this is a slightly bad English interpretation by the NIV, because the language is more, "Don't you care that we are going to drown?" He's not saying a hypothetical. These, again, are skilled boatsmen. They know we've taken on so much water. We're about to be at the bottom of this sea right now. And somehow he is still asleep. They're bailing out water as best as they can, slipping and sliding and falling all over the place. Big waves crashing down. Again, remember, something like water tornadoes all around them, and it's pitch black and it's terrifying. And Jesus is out cold. And they say, "Teacher, teacher, guy who says smart things, hey, don't you care that we're all about to die? Wake up. Don't you care what's going on?" Right? Some commentators likened what they said to, "Hey, grab a bucket. Help us. Like, pitch in. Do your part. We're all about to die here." But Jesus got up. So in this painting, we see all the men are huddled over to one side. But we know, again, waves are crashing in. They're bailing out water. They're slipping and sliding. They're falling down. I in my mind, when I hear Jesus got up, I think of that iconic painting of George Washington standing in the boat very stoically as they crossed that was not what happened, right? They were crashing into ice, and it was super cold and windy. George Washington wasn't standing in the front of the boat like this. But Jesus, stoically, like the hero of the story, rises to his feet and he rebukes the water. He tells the water what to do. He tells the water it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. He rebukes the wind. He rebukes the water. He says, "Be quiet. Be still." We know, if we look at it from a bit of a Old Testament vantage point, knowing what the disciples would have known, that the psalmists say that God rebuked the Red Sea, that God rebukes water, that God tells water what to do, and when it's not doing what he wants it to do, and then water falls in line. That's not something that a great teacher does. It's not something that a great boatsman does. It's something that only God does. And so he rebukes the water. He tells the water to be quiet, to be still. Again, that language might point us back to the Old Testament, a familiar passage for these men as they think back to the history, starting in Exodus, going through all of the Psalms, of God saying, "Be still and know that I am God." Jesus is telling the weather, "I'm God. I'm in charge here. You're going to calm down." Some commentators believe that a more accurate quote would be quiet and stay quiet." Almost like a annoyed parent lecturing a toddler. He just talks to the weather and to the sea. And the Sea of Galilee had this kind of mythical aura to it to the people who lived there. People died in it all the time. They saw it as this dark and deep, scary thing. And he stands up in the middle of all of this and he says, "I rebuke you. You do what I say. Be quiet. be peace, shalom, all that you should be. Silence. And then the wind died down and it was completely calm. And it was completely calm. Think of the biggest storm you've ever been through, physical storm you've ever been through in your life, inside of a house, or maybe you were stuck outside. And then imagine in the midst of all of that downpour and all of the chaos, it's just done. It doesn't say it slowly tapered off. It doesn't say, and then the storm kind of wrapped up. It said, done. God said, be quiet. And the weather listened to him. Then he turns to the disciples, right? He's just stood up. He's just rebuked the wind, one of the most terrifying things for people who know about the waterways, who were experts at the time. These storms, they kill people all the time. And then he turns to them and he says, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Do you still have no faith? Kind of a harsher rebuke than he gives to the weather, right? It's a jarring rebuke. It's not one that you want to hear in the situation. He says, you should be not afraid, but you should be asking yourselves, why do you still have no faith? He's asking them, you've seen me do all of these things, right? You've seen me do all these miracles and preach these great wisdoms to you, and yet you still have no faith. But we ought to think to ourselves for a minute that, again, almost all of Mark happens outside of the comfort zone of the disciples. This one story happens inside of the comfort zone of the disciples. And then frightening things happen in their familiarity. Life crashes into the midst of it, and they're in a place where they don't think that necessarily they need faith. I don't need faith to drive a boat. I've been doing it my entire life. We rarely think about our reliance upon God when we travel until we get into a crash. And then we're like, whoa, 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 whoa. Please, God, help me. As someone who's been through a couple big crashes in his lifetime, I'll tell you that the moments before, I was not thinking like, I'm sure glad God's helping me drive this vehicle right now. He's asking him, why do you not have faith in this situation? Remember what they asked him. Do you not care that we're going to die? They had already resolved it in their minds that that was what was going to happen. They did not believe in that moment that God had authority or that they needed to have faith in him. So we're not rebuking them saying they're horrible, wicked people. What we're saying is they were caught in their comfort zone and they thought for sure, because they're experts, this is the kind of storm that kills people. We have too much water in this boat. It's inevitable. We know what we're talking about. And Jesus says, be quiet. I rebuke you. Why are you afraid? Why do you have no faith? And then again, we get interesting word choices. Verse 40, he tells them, do not be afraid. Verse 41 says that they were terrified. They were terrified and they asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. He tells them to not be afraid of the storm, but they're terrified of him because he is somehow, some way bigger than the storm, and they can only ask themselves, who is this? See, they've seen him do things in other people's lives. But we have to remember for a moment that they've watched him heal people. They were never sick. He watched them drive out demons. They were never demon possessed. It's easy for us to say, man, God does amazing things over there. But then when it's chaos here in our little boat, it's not always easy for us to just say, well, God's going to be faithful. God's in charge here, especially when it's a place that we think we know so much. We need to remember that sometimes we paint this picture of the disciples like, man, they put their foot in their mouth a lot, especially Peter. He says things that he shouldn't say. They're in their element. If you were wanting to cross to the other side of the Sea of Galilee that night and you said, I need someone to take me, you would not have asked Jesus. You would have asked his disciples. They knew what they were doing. And yet in their familiarity, frightening things happen. Todd Bolzinger wrote this book called Canoeing the Mountains. It's a really good book about church leadership, and he uses the central metaphor of Lewis and Clark and how Lewis and Clark were great rivermen. They knew how to navigate and chart, and they were very comfortable in a canoe, and they were going to follow the water source out until they reached the Pacific Ocean. But they didn't know about this thing called the Rocky Mountains. So when they found the Rocky Mountains, they said, this is not the Pacific Ocean. I don't understand what's happening here. And so they needed a guide, Sacagawea, to take them through because they could not canoe the mountains. And so often we talk about this kind of uncharted territory thing. Probably in your mind, at least one point or another, as we're reading this and breaking it down, your head is going to the other Sea of Galilee story where Jesus is walking on the water and he calls Peter out of the boat, out of his comfort zone, into uncharted territory, into doing these scary things. But in this story, the scary things come into the familiarity. The storm crashes upon our safe place, where we're expert, where we know what we're talking about, where a lot of times we think, God, you can just take a nap in the back. I got this. This is not the same thing as going out of our comfort zone. This is resting firmly in our comfort zone, thinking I don't need God here. But then the storm comes, and goodness gracious, do we? G.K. Chesterton writes this really funny story at the beginning of a book called Orthodoxy. About a man who leaves England, a yachtsman who's going to go explore. He's going to find a new island. He's going to plant a flag and declare that island England. And he leaves and he sails off into the fog and he makes some miscalculations. He gets turned around, but he comes aboard a shoreline. And he thinks, this is it. I'm going to make my mark. I'm going to find New South Wales. I'm going to plant my flag for England. And as he hops off the ship and he's walking farther and farther, kind of terrified at this point because he doesn't know what lies ahead of him, he sees what looks like the outline of a building. He thinks maybe it's a ruin. Maybe he's found a place where an old civilization used to be. But when he gets closer, he realizes that he recognizes the building and he has discovered England. And he's weirdly very happy with that idea because he wasn't really fully prepared for the kind of chaos of what might be ahead of him if he landed on an island. And G.K. Chesterton, he uses that story to talk about this idea that with God, there is fascination and there's familiarity. He gives us these new big ideas that are fascinating, but when we get into them, we realize that this is how life was always supposed to be. It's very familiar, very close to us. And so we have this mixture of fascination and familiarity, of frightening things and familiarity, but we're much more okay with becoming familiar with the frightening things. The disciples, as we journey through Mark, they'll start to understand what he's talking about more. They'll start to know that he's in charge in situations. We have a reversal of that situation here. It would be as if the man went to just sail across the channel to what he thought was England, and when he got to the other side, it was a place that he'd never been before. Frightening came into familiarity. The storm came into their safe place, into their comfort zone, and they said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are going to die?" And then Jesus did something that was ridiculous because how in the world, healing people, that's kind of crazy. How can you be bigger than a storm? And so they said to themselves, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. And again, there's subtext here. They're saying, no one but God can do this. Jesus is saying, absolutely, you are 100% correct. No one but God can do this. And so our one big thing, if we take nothing else away from it this morning, we take away this. Jesus is Lord over the familiar and the frightening. And this changes everything. We are probably, most of us, more okay with him being Lord over the frightening. When the big scary things happen, we want to say, please help, please help, please help. But he's Lord over the familiar. He's Lord over that thing that you think that you do really, really well. And you think that maybe you can just tell God, I got this one, go take a nap. And no matter what it is, that thing is, God is Lord over it. There's this cycle that they warn about when you take seminary classes of becoming really good at the process of writing sermons. They say, oh, I can write a sermon, right? Like I've preached enough sermons, I can write a sermon. And so there's a way to go about even writing a sermon without God's help, where you're just like, I have the books, I have the process, I know how all of this works. I can take this and turn it into 35 minutes. But we need to understand that if Jesus walked into our church this morning, the proper response would not be, well, I put a couple hours work into the sermon. It would be, here is the pulpit. You're in charge. You're going to do a better job. And so this story is an interesting one in Mark because we're more inclined with the stories and the messages in church of venturing out of our comfort zone, of Peter getting out of the boat. But the storm comes into their little space. And they recognize in that moment, because of what Jesus does, that they need him everywhere. They need him in every space. So what do we do with this? Besides saying we need to identify the boats of our life, the little places where we say, God, I have this, I don't need that. We need to understand and have a shift in our lives where we're reminding ourselves of this so the hypothetical becomes the concrete. Remember, the disciples had seen things, they had heard stories, they had seen God heal other people, they hadn't been sick. They had seen God deliver demons, they had not had demons. They had not needed to be delivered until this moment, and they didn't like being on that end of the story. I don't like being on that end of the story. I want to tell people about like, oh man, I know all these people that God cured cancer, and it's amazing. I don't want to be the person who say, I had cancer and it sucked and God walked me through it. They're now on the other side of the story, but in their comfort zone. And so we need to have a confidence in God that when the storm comes, we know that this is concrete. It isn't just a story we've heard or we've seen, but it's one that we've experienced, that God delivers. And so as we close to a time of prayer and we come to the table in a time of singing, I want you to think today when you get up and you leave and you go down this center aisle, just pause for a second and look at how small that space is. And it's easy in our minds to say, well, can't I just be Lord of this much space? Can I be Lord of this ship here? Do I have to give him 100% of everything? I'm really, really good at this one thing. I could probably just do this without God. That's the temptation here. But the message is that God is Lord over the familiar and the frightening. And we need to invite him into even the small boats of our lives. Because when that storm comes, goodness, are we going to need him? Will you pray with me? Heavenly